Halloween Kills is the 12th installment in the Halloween franchise. Or is it the 3rd? Is this technically Halloween 2? Or is it a remake of Halloween 2? Or Halloween 2? If this is a direct sequel to Halloween, is it a sequel to Halloween, Halloween, or Halloween? I'm a pretty big fan of Halloween. Not so much the 11 films to come after it, but that original film is incredibly solid filmmaking and effectively birthed an entire genre, which is something that I can't go without recognizing. The preceding franchise that followed that first film was entirely unwarranted and equally almost entirely without merit, which is why I was ultimately pretty surprised when I saw the 2018 soft reboot of the franchise directed by David Gordon Green. I've grown to like the film less and less as time has gone on, but it's ultimately a pretty solid movie with an ambiguous but satisfying conclusion. So, when the trailer for Halloween Kills dropped, as well as the announcement of a new trilogy, I was at once dreading its coming. I knew I was going to talk about this movie when it came out, but initially I really had no idea how I would talk about it. I tried to think of ways to turn this into a quick 10-minute review, but there's really no way for me to do that, so I'll just have to do it this way. So just to give a quick spoiler-free review, because I know this movie is still very recent, Halloween Kills has gotten one of the most polarizing receptions out of any Halloween movie to date, and after seeing it twice now, I can confidently say that this is a mediocre and at times quite bad movie, carried along by only the slightest inkling of a plot and some admittedly pretty entertaining kills. This is the first Halloween movie in a long time to make Michael Myers actually feel threatening. In the previous films, he's been a blind killing machine, violently murdering anyone in his way. He has no motive, he has no target, whereas in this film, much of that remains the same, but once he is almost defeated, his mindless killing now turns into genuine rage. Michael is fucking pissed, and for him, nothing is off limits. It is because of this that this is possibly the most gruesome Halloween film since the Rob Zombie-led films, and while some gore here and there does make for some quality entertainment, the bordering on torture porn levels of violence within this movie is not something that has ever fit the Halloween franchise as much as Friday the 13th or even the Texas Chainsaw sequels, which are, by the way, all completely unwatchable and not worth your time in the slightest. Halloween Kills, just like its predecessor, have brought back John Carpenter, at least in some capacity, and his original score for this film is possibly a series best. Very synth-heavy, but it builds an incredible mood and had me genuinely on the edge of my seat at certain points. I'd honestly go so far as to say that it carries most of this movie, because without it doing all of the legwork in the building of tension and emotion, this movie would be about the flattest thing you could think of. And that's really the crux of the problem with this movie. While its positives do have the tendency to be quite good, it's unfortunately all in service of a pretty uninteresting and goofy narrative that left me just waiting for it to end. Though the direction and performances were at least serviceable, there's literally nothing going on here that is even remotely memorable. The cinematography is flat, the editing is probably the worst I've seen all year, the central character of this entire franchise is asleep for the first hour of the movie, and the rest of the time she just has fuck all to do, and the fan service has been pumped to an inhuman extreme. The thing about Halloween is that there's very little iconography outside of the villain, so they have no choice but to scrape the bottom of the barrel, digging up the most obscure bullshit from the original film. No joke, one of the main characters of this movie is a kid who was in one scene in the original. The story is absolutely the biggest problem here. This is the second part of a trilogy now, I guess, and it seems like they're shooting the last two films simultaneously, which is actually really smart. We all know what happens when you don't plan out a story spanning multiple films.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
As a result, this movie is largely just a buffer until we can get to the finale of this story. In terms of genuine plot development, this film has pretty much none of that. This is the first Halloween sequel that's actually planning ahead and setting up future installments. It's always been the same structure of the same few cast members as well as a rotating cast of slasher fodder with each new installment, but here's the problem. This movie does that too, but it's very clearly only half a story, so it spends a majority of this movie introducing new characters, so much so that their development almost overshadows the actual meat of the movie, the kills. It's trying to be both a character-driven Halloween drama, something that most definitely does not work, and the goofy, violent slasher Halloween sequel that we've come to expect. On top of that, I really just don't like the direction they've decided to take the story. The idea of the entire town mobilizing against Michael Michael Myers is so silly, and it left the story in a place where effectively nothing was changed, and I wasn't curious about what could happen next. This movie has so many identity issues. It has no idea what kind of movie it wants to be, so it's trying to be all of them at once. Sometimes it's a horror movie, sometimes it's a comedy, sometimes it's a character drama about coping with trauma, sometimes it's an action movie. When you're juggling that many tones, you're inadvertently sabotaging everything that works. This film managed only to bore me because I never had anything to connect to. If there was a serious moment, it was undercut with a joke. If there was a big scare, undercut with a joke. If it was actually on the precipice of warranting genuine emotions out of me, undercut with either a joke or a fake out scare. If this movie was trying to be ironic and deconstruct the Halloween narrative, then it's certainly not doing a good job. I don't know what the third film has in store, but if it's anything akin to this, which is already such a deviation from even its predecessor, I fear this franchise has nowhere to go but even further into the hole that it's already in. And on that note, I'm gonna have to get into spoilers here, so if you haven't seen this movie yet and you want to, click on the timestamp on screen now to avoid spoilers, or just click off the video and come back once you've seen the movie. There's your warning. 3, 2, 1. So I said before that Laurie Strode spends more than half of this movie in a coma, and that's true. So right off the bat, this movie seems to have its priorities completely fucked. The first film ends with some ambiguity, and when I first saw that film in 2018, I was interested in where they would take the story if they greenlit a sequel. So sitting down to see this movie, I expected to find out. Only it takes nearly 20 minutes to catch up to where the previous film left off, and by that point, you've already been hit with so much exposition and new characters that it feels so disjointed. The film opens with a flashback sequence showing the events that took place immediately after the end of the 1978 original, which not only ruins the ending of the original, but is also just so out of place. The dialogue in this scene is so stilted, and I can't tell if it's trying to pay homage to campy 70s writing, but regardless, it's still incredibly clunky and doesn't deliver well at all. The fan service right off the bat is just groan-worthy. I mean, these characters talk as though they are trying to have a fluid conversation, but all it ends up sounding like is, "Duh, Michael Myers is here, remember him? Yeah." After that, we move on to the post-prologue, the scene at the bar that immediately establishes like 6 characters, and it's all very quick and has no flow. Also, the editing in this scene in particular is awful. Okay, these 2 characters are trying to have a conversation, but the people sitting behind them are being loud, so they ask them to quiet down. Instead of showing this in a way that actually allows you to fully understand what's going on, it shoots the couple separately, and the reverse shot of the group cuts off their faces and just drifts around aimlessly. This footage feels like it wasn't supposed to go here. Did you not get enough coverage? Then one of the new characters, Tommy Doyle, who was a kid in the first movie that I don't remember, gets on stage and starts delivering this incredibly goofy speech about Michael Myers, and the camera work gets even more confusing. This speech feels like it goes on for 10 minutes because it's constantly cutting to random shots that are sometimes in frame and sometimes out of frame. It looks bad and confusing. And then finally, 20 minutes into the movie, we catch up with the Strode women. There's the scene where Michael breaks out of the burning house, and it was at this point that I knew this movie was going to be a little different. It seems as though they realized that in a world where mass violence isn't all that out of the ordinary, someone going out and killing 3 people in 1978 no longer seems like a very big deal. So the way they make up for that in this movie is just by having Michael murder absolutely fucking everybody. I didn't bother to count, but I'd say he kills like 30 people throughout this one movie. In this scene alone, he kills like 6 firefighters, and it only goes up from there. Now, typically I would credit this movie for not being afraid of showing graphic violence for the sake of box office, because that's something Halloween has fallen victim to before and severely suffered for. But I've been sitting here for over 20 minutes to finally get to what is supposed to be a direct continuation of a story that ended 1/3 of the way through. Whatever interest I had in this story has waned significantly because it insists on setting up new things that I do not care about. It genuinely genuinely feels as though they had no idea they were gonna make another movie, so they exhausted all of their ideas in the previous film and had to just make shit up for these last two. For example, the Doctor character from the previous film was obsessed with Michael Myers, and while one can say that this was used as a plot device to get Michael where he needed to be for the third act, it's still an idea that could have been expanded upon in hypothetical sequels. Except that Doctor died in that same movie, and the mere concept of Michael Myers having sympathizers is entirely forgotten. It makes everything in this franchise feel incredibly inconsistent when the overarching villain, one of the only consistencies throughout this entire series, is so often having his story reworked and tweaked with each new film. I like the direction that they took with Michael Myers in this movie, but it was portrayed in such a flip-floppy way across these two films, it can't help but feel disconnected. After Michael is set loose, the film pretty much stagnates for the remainder of the runtime. Laurie's taken to the hospital and undergoes surgery, and this is where possibly one of the biggest issues with the film comes into play: the timeline. Okay, so this is all supposed to take place on the same night as the previous film, which is bizarre, seeing as how in the previous film, the final confrontation takes long after Halloween night has ended, and by the time the movie's over, one's mind attempts to piece the events together and set them on a strict timeline. It should be like 3 p.m. by the time Halloween Kills rears its head, but Laurie undergoes fucking abdominal surgery in what seems like 10 minutes, and Michael's killing spree is elongated even further. Is the third movie gonna take place on the same night as well? Characters hop around from place to place whenever it seems convenient. There's no real geography to the town, and passage of time, or at least the indication of it, is entirely absent. This all gets very confusing when you have scenes like this, with the group of Myers victims banding together like something lifted straight out of an 80s movie, and despite the fact that all these characters are running around town, recruiting people, stalking neighborhoods, telling people to stay inside, it feels as though this all could have happened in the span of a few seconds. The pacing is so all over the place for most of this movie that it somehow makes 100 minutes feel like a slog. And while I'm on the topic of the characters, I do not know a single person's name in this movie besides Laurie and Michael. They are the only two pieces on the board that matter, and from the word go, the film is doing absolutely nothing in trying to convince you otherwise. Despite the fact that half a dozen new characters are introduced and all tie into the source material at least in one way or another, you would think that they're gearing up for a final installment with an expanded cast of characters. Only that's not the case. Instead, all of these characters are set up, get half a movie worth of development, and then die just as soon as they appear. They are entirely expendable. These characters are one-note, shallow, archetypal bodies for Michael to cut through like butter. I don't know how the filmmakers expect me to feel for anything going on in this story when you've explained to me pretty bluntly that these characters matter and these ones don't. It's so transparent and objectively lazy that seeing this film for a second time left me bored to the point of farce. And by the time I had gotten to the end of the film, I had gained nothing except a precious longing for the last 2 hours of my life back. This film is absolutely embarrassing. It all comes to a head with yet another Myers showdown, this time at his childhood home, and without the creative set pieces and genuine tension that the previous film had, it left me unmoved and bored. The violence is graphic and certainly got me to let out a couple oohs throughout the film's run, but it all feels so soulless, as though it was doing nothing but padding time until the actual story can pick back up and the movie can start. Seeing Halloween Kills was effectively like watching a 2-hour-long trailer for Halloween Ends, a film that I assume will improve on some of these pacing and structuring problems, seeing as how they must actually have an ending for it, but from what we have now, looking at Kills in isolation, it is an underwhelming, creatively bankrupt waste of my time, and if the third film ends up being any better, I would skip this one altogether come next Halloween season, which is something I can't say for its predecessors. I couldn't wait for the credits to roll on this movie, so I never had to sit through another one of these cursed Halloween sequels. What an absolute waste of time. Even the best aspects of this movie are not near abundant enough to make sitting through this 100-minute slog more than once, and even then, that's a stretch. I've seen the movie twice now, and even though people were talking over the movie the entire time the first time I saw it, I got absolutely nothing out of a rewatch. Halloween Kills is nothing but a husk of what Halloween used to be, its villain now being pointlessly complicated and developed, and the story being artificially elongated to impossible lengths for a story that should have ended in 1978. I really wasn't all that upset with this movie the first time I saw it, but sitting down and writing this review has made me realize that there is so much wrong here that it's basically inexcusable. It's passable, but that's ultimately much worse than if it were bad. It's just incredibly saddening to see when I'm still of the belief that you could do something actually interesting with the Halloween name. Rob Zombie got a lot of shit wrong, but a reinterpretation of the story is really the only way to dig yourself out of the massive hole that the relentless sequels have dug since the 1980s. But that being said, I am so exhausted. Halloween has been shot dead as a franchise, and after this trilogy finally rears its head, I sincerely hope that they're done for good. I know you can't put the brakes on the money train, but the only thing coming from these new movies is a growing disdain for the franchise, and the burial of the genius of the original with mediocrity. I gave this movie a 6 out of 10 initially on Letterboxd, but I'm bringing it down to a 2. I'm highly anticipating never watching this movie again. I don't know if I'll be checking out the third film in the trilogy or not, as this one has brought my morale down to a crippling low. Don't see this movie. It's not worth the price of admission, and it's hardly even worth the free trial for Peacock. I got more enjoyment out of typing my credit card number in than watching what it was I was paying for. Fuck this movie.